trying to do it right. I've been living a lonely life. I've been sleeping here instead. I've been sleeping in my bed. Sleeping in my bed. So show me family, all the blood that I will bleed. I don't know where I belong. I don't know where I went wrong. I can write a song. I belong with you, you belong with me, my sweetheart. I belong with you, you belong with me, my sweetheart. I don't think you're right for him. Look at what it might have been. Took a bus to Chinatown. I'd be standing on Canal and Bowery. She'd be standing next to me. I belong with you, you belong with me, my sweetheart. I belong with you, you belong with me, my sweetheart. Love, we need it now. Let's go. Oh, son. Where we now. I belong with you, you belong with me, my sweetheart. I belong with you, you belong with me, my sweetheart.
All right, A-Push people, Mr. Beamer here. That was the longest intro song in the history of Beamer Home Video. Wow. All right, now this is why I chose it. Work with me here. I looked online for the Stubborn songs, and I get Stubborn Love by the Lumineers. I'm like, who are those people? So I listened to it, and in that song, the word stubborn's not even in there. So I'm like, all right. But then I look off to the right, and off the right from the Lumineers is the song Ho Hey. I'm like, I think I know that song. And I do. In the year 2014 Hudsonville High School Review Show, that song was sung by Sam, Lauren, and Caitlin. It was an incredible song. It fired me up. By the way, Caitlin is A-Push alumni, so there's a shout out to her. And so that is why I chose that song. It actually relates a little bit to World War I. All right, after the introduction, I have no idea where I want to go now. I'm going to keep this as brief as possible. So here you go. It's going to be brief. All right, fighting stopped Armistice Day, November 1918. What I want you to know, United States, our main contribution to World War I is we provided resources, okay, to help win the war, not necessarily battlefield victories. In fact, I don't even want you to know, you don't need to know any victories, any battles of World War I, except that it was trench warfare, okay? And in the end, highlight this, okay, why did the United States make the difference in the war? It was the supplies that we did provide the Allies and the thought that we had an endless supply of American soldiers to fight against the Germans, basically forced the ceasefire between the Allies and Central Powers. The last 10 sections are about the peace process, and it is a lot, and they're all short. So I'm going to try to give you the key things that you need to know. All right, so Wilson's popularity was at an all-time high following the Armistice Day, November 11, 1918. People loved Wilson around the world. He was a hero for helping end this war. So he decides, Woodrow Wilson, to go to Paris to oversee the final peace treaty, and that is very rare of a president to leave the country and to try to be a part of the final peace treaty. Usually they'll send the Secretary of State. Some Republicans were mad that he went, and even more so, the Republicans hated Wilson because he did not include a single Republican, and this is very important to highlight this, and Wilson hated the Republicans. He was very stubborn, there's that word, with the Republicans, and so now we have conflict continuing or mounting between Wilson and the Republicans, and it will continue. All right, at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, we have the Big Four. Here are the Big Four countries there representing the Allies. Italy, France, Britain, and the United States. You don't need to know the leaders of these countries, but know that these were the main leaders or the main countries of the Allies. All right, at first, these European leaders did agree to Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations. If you remember his 14 points, Woodrow Wilson's obsession was with his League of Nations. He wanted this more than any of his points, and so his allies actually agreed to it in the beginning. And so during the peace process, Wilson actually has to leave Paris to go back to the United States and attend some domestic issues. All right, so Woodrow Wilson come home while the peace process is still going on, and he is hammered by the Republicans who despise Woodrow Wilson, and they said they're not going to pass any treaty that includes the League of Nations. They're like, we are not going to get dragged into another war, so they were very against the League of Nations. You need to know these three guys. Highlight them: Henry Cabot Lodge, William Borah, and Hiram Johnson. Okay, these were the three leading Republicans who bitterly opposed the League. A lot more about them later. The most important one is Henry Cabot Lodge. Remember that name. The other two do have some significance as well. All right, so Wilson goes back to France after being home for a short period of time, and he was weakened because of all the opposition from the Republicans. So when he goes back to France, he is not the hero that he was going earlier when he went to the first peace conference for the first time. So he doesn't have as much power. So he is forced to compromise with these leaders because they know that Wilson doesn't quite have as much support back in the United States. So when he goes back to Paris for the second time, there's growing dislike for Wilson from other nations, and so he is not quite the hero that he was earlier, right after the end of the war. All right, so let's talk about this treaty, and it's not on this page, but let's write it down now. This final treaty is called the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, and that's a huge, you need to know the Treaty of Versailles. It's one of the key points. So Germany, highlight this, is forced to sign the treaty. And maybe you remember a lot of this from 10th grade history, because I think World War I is covered in detail there. So Germany does not like the treaty at all, but they're forced to sign it, and they had to pay huge reparations. I would write down the amount. They had to pay $33 billion to France and Great Britain and the other allies. Germany could not afford that amount, and Germany is basically devastated economically by the reparations, the money they had to pay. All right, in the end, Wilson has to compromise with the other European leaders just to keep his League of Nations. So most of his initial 14 points were not used. He had to give up those ideas in order to get his League of Nations, which is a part of the final treaty. So now Woodrow Wilson comes back to America with this new treaty called the Treaty of Versailles, and he meets fierce opposition from a number of groups, especially most of them were all Republicans, and so he's going to have a difficult time getting this treaty passed by the Senate. We mentioned Henry Cabot Lodge earlier. He is probably his biggest enemy, and he actually delayed the treaty reading because he read the entire 264 pages aloud in the Senate just to waste time so he can get more support from the American people against the Treaty of Versailles. All right, you need to know these two groups, and the first thing you know is that these two groups were Republicans, and they were against the Treaty of Versailles. So the Republicans were split into two different groups: the irreconcilables and the reservationists. Okay, so the leading irreconcilables were Borah and Johnson. So William Borah and Hiram Johnson, you need to know that. And they were not going to accept the treaty at all. No matter what changes were made, they're not going to accept the treaty at all. The reservationists would accept the final treaty if certain changes were made. Okay, if there were certain reservations made to the treaty that were proposed by Lodge, then maybe they would accept the new treaty. And so, because of this feud, a personal war develops between Lodge and Wilson, and they absolutely hate each other. And I would put this hatred and feud between Lodge and Wilson as one of the greatest feuds in APUSH. I kind of equate it to John Brown with pretty much everybody in the South, Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson's hatred, and finally Alexander Hamilton with, well, anybody with a pulse. All right, here's a visual of some of the key Republicans that you need to know. Lodge, reservationist, was probably more conservative economically than some of the other Republicans as well. William Borah and Hiram Johnson, know that they're irreconcilables, but yet they were somewhat different. William Borah was just an anti-imperialist, so he did not want America to get involved in other countries at all. So that was his viewpoint. And Hiram Johnson was an irreconcilable that was a progressive. Thus, he wanted America to focus its resources on domestic issues. All right, so Wilson is facing fierce opposition from the Republicans, so the only way to get this thing passed was by going to the people, trying to persuade the people to encourage their senators to pass the Treaty of Versailles. So Woodrow Wilson decides to take a tour of the United States to gain support for the treaty. So he's going to go around the country to make speeches and to get people fired up for the treaty to support it. And so the irreconcilable Republicans, Johnson and Bohr, we mentioned those two on the previous slide, they actually follow Wilson to every city that he goes to. So Wilson will give a speech, and then a day or two later, these two guys will give a speech condemning the Treaty of Versailles. So they're like hounding Wilson everywhere he went. Eventually, and this is so sad, President Woodrow Wilson collapses in Denver, Colorado on his return home back from California. So he suffers a stroke, he suffers physical and nervous exhaustion, and he basically is physically unable to complete the presidency. And it's so sad because he gave his entire heart and soul to getting the Treaty of Versailles passed, and in the end, it cost him his health. All right, so now Woodrow Wilson is struggling with his health. Now, Henry Cabot Lodge comes up with a new idea for the treaty, and he comes up with the 14 reservations. And a little bit of irony in the number of reservations, 14 is kind of a slap in the face to Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. So basically, he said if these 14 reservations are added to the treaty, then his reservationists would sign the Treaty of Versailles. The biggest issue Congress had was with Article 10. I would highlight this. This is the one thing that had many congressmen and senators nervous. Article 10 basically stated that if a member nation of the League of Nations was attacked, the other nations would have to help out that nation. So Article 10, in summary, would drag us into a potential war if a country was attacked. And many senators did not want that. So they did not want to have another war because World War I was so bad. This last point I think is one of the most important of the entire video. After the 14 reservations are proposed, Woodrow Wilson convinces his Democrats to vote against the treaty with the reservations. So this is so almost unbelievable to think about that Wilson told his Democrats to vote against the Treaty of Versailles. Now, there were these 14 reservations, but Wilson, in his stubbornness, kills the treaty with the reservations. So this first vote is taken with the treaty with reservations, and it is defeated rather substantially. Okay, about 4/5 of the senators actually said they didn't mind the treaty with the reservations if they could just be adjusted. So the reservations were slightly adjusted, and a vote came up again in the Senate 5 months later, March 1920, and the treaty failed again because Woodrow Wilson still told his Democrats to not vote for the treaty with reservations. So I think this is so important right here. If Woodrow Wilson and Lodge would have compromised with each other, the Treaty of Versailles with the reservations would have passed. But because of their stubbornness and their personal hatred of each other, the Treaty of Versailles never passes in the United States. That is so important. And so Republicans mocked Wilson, saying that he kept us out of peace. If you remember, that was his campaign slogan in 1916, he kept us out of war. So now they're saying he kept us out of peace by telling the Democrats to vote against the Treaty of Versailles with the reservations. So in the end, I'd write this down. The United States is the only country to never sign the Treaty of Versailles. The rest of Europe does. And it's so ironic because most of the treaty was created by Woodrow Wilson and the United States. So we made it, but we didn't join it. All right, the final two sections. Okay, the first one refers to the election of 1920. And so Republicans nominate Warren G. Harding and Democrats choose James Cox. Don't need to know him. Need to know this guy. Warren G. Harding, Republican, wins this election in 1920. And this is also the first election where women can vote with the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. So that's definitely exciting. And so in the end, U.S. isolationism doomed the Treaty of Versailles. We did not want to get involved in the League of Nations. So that's probably the biggest reason why we didn't join the treaty, along with Wilson's stubbornness. And because we never joined the League of Nations, it indirectly leads to World War II because there's not a world power that is strong enough and willing to stop the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany in the 1930s. Or then the final section I already mentioned, the League of Nations was severely weakened without the United States. Did not have power to stop Germany in the 1930s with the rise of the Nazis. All right, and in conclusion, I know you've already read this section, but let me just read it to you. The last two sentences are outstanding of the chapter. Here it is. If for no other reason, the United States should have used its enormous strength to shape world-shaking events. Instead, it permitted itself blithely to drift toward the abyss of a second and even more bloody international disaster I give you World War II.